This interview was supposed to be friendly, but one question completely changed the tone on live television. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not because of raised voices or dramatic walk-offs, but because two people with very different perspectives simply refuse to move past a point they both feel strongly about. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began in a way that would have felt completely familiar to anyone who regularly watches daytime talk shows in the United States. Chris Pratt had joined the panel to promote his latest film project, and the conversation initially focused on his career, his transition from comedy to more serious roles, and how his public image had evolved over the years. The tone was light, relaxed, and friendly, with the hosts taking turns asking questions that allowed Pratt to reflect on his work without any real pressure. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at the center of the table, opened with a general comment about how audiences often struggle to separate actors from the characters they play. She mentioned that viewers sometimes expect celebrities to represent certain values just because of the roles they've taken on, especially when those roles become culturally significant. Pratt nodded along, smiling, and agreed that it was something he had experienced firsthand. At that point, the exchange still felt completely standard. Pratt spoke calmly about how he appreciates fans, but also feels that actors are sometimes placed into boxes that don't reflect who they actually are. He said he tries to keep his personal life private and focus on his work, because once public expectations get involved, it becomes difficult to manage how people interpret everything you say or do. One of the co-hosts added that social media has made this even more complicated, since even a small comment can quickly turn into a larger discussion. Pratt agreed again, noting that he's learned to be careful about what he shares publicly, not because he wants to avoid controversy, but because he doesn't want to distract from the projects he's working on. Whoopi then shifted the conversation slightly by bringing up the idea of responsibility. She said that whether celebrities like it or not, their words carry weight, especially when they have large platforms. She emphasized that this doesn't mean actors have to take political stances on everything, but that silence can also be interpreted as a position in itself. This was the first moment where the tone subtly changed. Pratt didn't immediately respond with the same easy agreement. Instead, he paused briefly, which on live television is often noticeable. He then said that he understands what Whoopi was saying, but he doesn't fully agree with the idea that public figures owe constant commentary on social or political issues. He explained that while he respects people who choose to use their platforms that way, he personally feels more comfortable letting his work speak for itself. He said he worries that once celebrities start feeling obligated to speak on every topic, it can create a situation where their opinions are treated as more important than those of everyday people, even when they don't have any special expertise. Whoopi listened closely, leaning slightly forward in her chair, which is something longtime viewers recognize as a sign that she's about to engage more directly. She responded by saying that she wasn't suggesting celebrities should dominate conversations, but that when you benefit from public attention, it's natural for people to expect some level of engagement with real-world issues. At this point, the studio audience was quiet, which often happens when a conversation shifts from light entertainment into something more thoughtful. There was no laughter or applause, just attentive listening. The co-hosts also seemed more focused, with one of them nodding along while another glanced briefly at Whoopi and then back at Pratt. Pratt replied in a measured tone, saying that he doesn't see himself as someone who should be setting examples for millions of people simply because he's famous. He said he'd rather be honest about his limits and admit that he's just a person with opinions, not a spokesperson for broader social movements. This is where the disagreement became clearer, not in a confrontational way, but in a philosophical one. Whoopi said that the issue isn't about being a spokesperson, but about acknowledging influence. She pointed out that even choosing not to speak sends a message, whether intended or not, because fans often look for cues from people they admire. Pratt responded by saying that he thinks that expectation can become unhealthy, both for celebrities and for audiences. He explained that he doesn't want people to form their beliefs based on what actors say in interviews. He said he'd rather encourage people to think independently and engage with issues directly instead of waiting for famous people to comment. There was a slight shift in body language across the panel at this point. One of the co-hosts attempted to lighten the moment by making a brief joke about how nobody should be taking life advice from movie stars anyway, which earned a small laugh from the audience. But the underlying tension didn't disappear, because both Pratt and Whoopi seemed invested in continuing the discussion. Whoopi responded by saying that while she agrees people should think independently, the reality is that influence exists whether people want it or not. She said that when someone has a platform as large as Pratt's, their choices can shape conversations, even unintentionally. She emphasized that this doesn't mean celebrities have to be perfect or always right, but that being aware of impact is part of being in the public eye. Pratt, still calm but now more direct, said that he sometimes feels that celebrities are placed under unrealistic moral expectations. He said that actors are hired to entertain, not to lead social change, and that expecting them to take on that role can create unnecessary pressure and backlash. The audience reaction at this point was mixed. Some people nodded, while others seemed more aligned with Whoopi's perspective. There was no audible reaction, but the camera briefly cut to a few audience members who appeared thoughtful rather than reactive. One of the co-hosts tried to bridge the gap by suggesting that there might be a middle ground, where celebrities can choose when to speak without feeling obligated to comment on everything. She said that perhaps the real issue is authenticity, whether someone is speaking because they genuinely care or because they feel forced. Pratt agreed with that point, saying that forced statements often come across as insincere and can do more harm than good. He said he'd rather remain silent on some topics than say something just to meet expectations. Whoopi acknowledged that authenticity matters, but she pushed back slightly by saying that silence can also be interpreted as avoidance, especially during moments when people are looking for solidarity or acknowledgement from public figures. This was the moment where Pratt gently challenged Whoopi's framing. He said that he doesn't see silence as avoidance in every case. He explained that sometimes not speaking is a conscious choice to avoid contributing to noise or misinformation. He said he believes it's okay for people, including celebrities, to step back when they don't feel informed enough. The tone remained respectful, but there was a noticeable seriousness in both of their voices. Neither was trying to dominate the conversation, but both were clearly holding firm to their viewpoints. The studio remained quiet, with no interruptions from producers or commercial cues, indicating that the discussion was still within acceptable boundaries for live television. Whoopi responded by saying that she appreciates the honesty in Pratt's perspective, but she still feels that being visible comes with responsibilities, even uncomfortable ones. She said that the platform itself creates a relationship with the audience, and that relationship includes expectations, fair or not. Pratt concluded his part of the exchange by saying that he understands where she's coming from, but he believes that responsibility should ultimately lie with individuals, not celebrities. He said that people should be encouraged to engage with issues through reliable sources and personal reflection, rather than celebrity commentary. As part one of the segment came to a close, the atmosphere on set felt noticeably different from the beginning. What started as a standard promotional interview had turned into a thoughtful, quietly tense discussion about influence, responsibility, and public expectations. There were no raised voices, no dramatic moments, but there was a clear sense that two experienced public figures had reached a genuine point of disagreement that neither was fully willing to move past. The camera pulled back slightly, showing the full panel as one of the co-hosts prepared to transition to the next question, and the audience remained attentive, aware that they had just witnessed a rare moment of honest, unscripted debate unfolding in real time on a daytime talk show. As the conversation continued, the co-host who had attempted to lighten the mood earlier gently guided the discussion back toward a more general angle, asking Pratt how he personally decides what to share publicly and what to keep private. The intention seemed to be to ease the tension without ignoring what had just been said. On live television, these transitions often feel subtle, but regular viewers can usually sense when a host is trying to stabilize the tone of a segment. Pratt took a moment before answering, and this time his voice was slightly slower, more reflective. He said that over the years, he's learned that being open doesn't always mean being visible about everything. He explained that early in his career, he felt pressure to engage constantly, to be active online, and to share opinions because it felt like part of the job. But as his audience grew, he became more cautious. He said that he started asking himself whether sharing something would actually contribute anything meaningful, or whether it would simply create more noise. He mentioned that there's a difference between expressing genuine thoughts and feeling pushed into commentary because people expect it. Whoopi listened, nodding slowly, but her expression suggested she still wasn't entirely convinced. She responded by saying that what Pratt described made sense on a personal level, but she wanted to emphasize that public figures don't operate in a vacuum. She said that when millions of people follow someone, even small decisions can take on larger significance. One of the other hosts added that viewers often project expectations onto celebrities, sometimes unfairly, but that this projection becomes part of the public relationship. She said that audiences don't just watch actors on screen. They also follow their interviews, social media posts, and public appearances, which creates a sense of familiarity. Pratt acknowledged that point and said he's aware that people feel connected to him in ways he can't always control. He said he appreciates that support, but he doesn't think it automatically means he should step into roles he didn't choose, like being a moral guide or social commentator. The studio audience remained quiet, but engaged. There was no applause or laughter, just a kind of focused stillness that often accompanies serious discussions on daytime television. The cameras alternated between close-ups of Pratt and Whoopi, capturing their expressions and subtle body language. Pratt remained relaxed in his posture, but his hands were now clasped together on the table, suggesting a more thoughtful, contained energy. Whoopi responded by saying that she wasn't asking him to be a moral guide, but she felt that visibility naturally brings influence, and influence brings impact, whether intentional or not. She said that even choosing not to speak can be interpreted as a statement, especially during times when people are looking for reassurance or acknowledgement from those they admire. Pratt gently pushed back again, saying that he worries about the idea that silence must always be interpreted as something negative. He said that sometimes silence is simply a way of acknowledging complexity or recognizing that you don't have enough information to speak responsibly. He explained that in the current media environment, people are often expected to react immediately to events, even before all the facts are known. He said that this creates a culture of constant reaction, which can lead to misunderstandings and oversimplification. Whoopi agreed that rushed reactions can be harmful, but she added that there's also a risk in disengagement. She said that when influential people remain quiet during important moments, some audiences may feel dismissed or ignored, even if that wasn't the intention. At this point, one of the co-hosts leaned in and asked whether Pratt felt differently about speaking on issues directly related to his work, such as representation in film or working conditions in the industry. This question seemed to offer a more specific angle, possibly to move the conversation away from abstract philosophy and into something more concrete. Pratt responded that he does feel more comfortable speaking on topics where he has firsthand experience. He said that within the entertainment industry, he's more willing to share opinions because he understands the context and feels he can contribute something informed. He added that outside of that space, he's more cautious, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't want to oversimplify complex issues or speak over people who are more directly affected. Whoopi acknowledged that distinction and said that it made sense. She said that lived experience matters, and that people should speak from what they know. However, she reiterated that the platform itself still creates expectations, and that celebrities can't always separate their professional roles from their public identities. The conversation now felt less like a disagreement and more like a slow, careful exploration of two different philosophies. Pratt emphasized individual responsibility and personal boundaries, while Whoopi emphasized collective impact and public accountability. Neither raised their voice, and neither appeared defensive, but the contrast in their viewpoints remained clear. The audience reaction subtly shifted. A few people nodded when Pratt spoke about avoiding uninformed commentary, while others seemed to agree with Whoopi's emphasis on influence. The lack of strong reactions suggested that viewers were processing the discussion rather than taking sides. One of the co-hosts summarized what had been said so far, noting that the debate seemed to center on whether public influence should be embraced as a responsibility or managed as a personal choice. She said that both perspectives reflected real tensions that many public figures face today. Pratt agreed with that summary and said that he doesn't think there's a single correct approach. He said that different people handle visibility differently, and that what works for one person might not work for another. Whoopi responded by saying that she respects that, but she also believes that public figures have an opportunity to shape conversations in positive ways. She said that even small gestures or statements can make people feel seen and heard. Pratt replied that he doesn't disagree with the idea of positive impact, but he believes it should come from genuine intent rather than obligation. He said that when people speak because they feel forced, it often comes across as performative, which can undermine trust. This word, performative, seemed to resonate across the panel. One of the co-hosts commented that audiences today are very sensitive to authenticity, and that viewers can often tell when someone is speaking from conviction versus compliance. Whoopi agreed, but added that authenticity and responsibility don't have to conflict. She said that people can be both genuine and aware of their influence at the same time. Pratt nodded and said that ideally, that balance is what everyone should aim for. He said that he's still figuring out where that balance lies for him personally, and that his approach may change over time. As the segment continued, the tension gradually softened. The disagreement remained, but it no longer felt like a challenge. Instead, it felt like a thoughtful exchange between two people who had different experiences and priorities. The camera briefly cut to the studio audience again, showing a few people smiling slightly, as if relieved that the conversation had remained respectful and grounded. There was a sense that viewers were witnessing something honest rather than scripted, which is often what daytime talk shows aim for during more serious discussions. One of the co-hosts finally suggested transitioning back to Pratt's upcoming film, noting that the discussion had touched on deeper themes than originally planned. She made a light comment about how promotional interviews sometimes turn into philosophical debates, which drew a small, relaxed laugh from the audience. Pratt smiled at that and said that he appreciated the chance to have a real conversation rather than just repeating talking points. Whoopi smiled as well, and said that those moments are often the most interesting part of live television. Even though the topic shifted, the earlier exchange lingered in the atmosphere. It had changed the tone of the segment, making it feel more reflective and less purely promotional. Viewers watching at home would likely have noticed the shift, sensing that something meaningful had unfolded, even if it didn't involve dramatic confrontation. As the hosts began asking about the film again, the panel's energy slowly returned to a more familiar rhythm. But the underlying disagreement between Pratt and Whoopi remained part of the narrative, not resolved, just acknowledged and set aside for the moment, the way many real conversations on live television end up unfolding. As the discussion moved back toward Chris Pratt's upcoming film, the shift felt natural on the surface, but there was still a subtle awareness across the panel that the earlier exchange hadn't fully faded from the room. On live daytime television, these moments often linger quietly, shaping the tone of what follows even when the topic changes. One of the co-hosts asked Pratt about what initially drew him to the project, framing it as a story about resilience and personal growth. Pratt answered comfortably, describing the script and the character, but his tone was slightly more reserved than at the start of the segment. It wasn't tense, just more thoughtful, as if he was still carrying some of the weight of the earlier conversation. Whoopi listened, occasionally nodding, and the camera caught her glancing at Pratt a few times in a way that suggested she was still engaged with his perspective, even though the subject had shifted. She asked a follow-up question about how the film addressed themes of identity and change, which indirectly echoed some of the ideas they had just discussed. Pratt responded by saying that one of the reasons he liked the role was because the character struggles with expectations from others. He said that the story explores how people often feel pressured to become versions of themselves that others want, rather than staying true to who they actually are. This comment created a subtle bridge back to the earlier topic, and both Pratt and Whoopi seemed to recognize it. Whoopi commented that it sounded like a theme many people could relate to, especially in a world where public opinion plays such a large role in shaping personal identity. Pratt agreed and said that whether you're famous or not, there's always tension between external expectations and internal values. He said that fame just amplifies that tension, making every decision feel more visible and more open to interpretation. The studio audience responded with light applause at this point, not loud or enthusiastic, but appreciative, as if they connected with the idea on a personal level. The energy in the room became slightly warmer, easing some of the earlier seriousness. One of the co-hosts then asked Pratt how he handles criticism, especially when it comes from people who don't know him personally but feel strongly about his public image. Pratt said that he's learned not to take everything personally, but that it's still difficult at times. He explained that when people criticize you online or in the media, it often feels less like feedback and more like judgment. He said that it can be challenging to separate constructive criticism from noise, especially when the criticism is based on assumptions rather than facts. Whoopi responded by saying that criticism is part of being in the public eye, but she acknowledged that the volume and intensity have increased significantly with social media. She said that when she first started in television, public reactions were slower and more limited, whereas now everything happens instantly. Pratt said that's one of the reasons he's cautious about engaging publicly. He said that responding to every comment or controversy can become exhausting and emotionally draining, and that sometimes stepping back is the healthiest option. Whoopi agreed with that point, and for the first time since the disagreement began, there was a noticeable moment of alignment. She said that protecting mental health is important, and that no one should feel obligated to absorb constant public scrutiny. This agreement shifted the dynamic again, making the conversation feel more collaborative. One of the co-hosts commented that the pressures of visibility affect not just celebrities, but also ordinary people who share their lives online. Pratt nodded and said that the difference is scale. He said that when millions of people are watching, even small mistakes can feel overwhelming. He added that he tries to remind himself that he's still just a person, not a symbol. Whoopi smiled slightly at that and said that while she understands the desire not to be seen as a symbol, public figures inevitably become representations of something, whether they choose to or not. She said that the challenge is learning how to live with that reality without losing your sense of self. Pratt responded by saying that he's still learning how to navigate that balance. He said that early in his career, he tried to please everyone, but over time he realized that it's impossible. He said that now he focuses on staying consistent with his own values, even if that means disappointing some people. The audience reacted with another brief round of light applause, suggesting that this message resonated. The atmosphere in the studio now felt more reflective than tense, as if the earlier disagreement had evolved into a deeper conversation rather than a conflict. One of the co-hosts summarized the discussion by saying that being in the public eye requires constant negotiation between personal identity and public perception. She said that the conversation had highlighted how complex that negotiation can be. Pratt agreed and said that he doesn't think there's a perfect solution. He said that everyone has to figure out their own boundaries, and that those boundaries may change over time. Whoopi added that what matters most is being honest with yourself and with your audience. She said that even when people disagree, respectful conversations can help everyone better understand different perspectives. This comment seemed to acknowledge the earlier disagreement without reopening it. Pratt nodded and said that he appreciated the chance to talk openly about these issues on a platform like this. The camera briefly cut to the audience again, showing several people watching attentively, some nodding along. The overall mood was calm and thoughtful, with no sign of lingering hostility. As the segment continued, the hosts asked a few more standard questions about the film, including release dates and what audiences could expect. Pratt answered smoothly, and the conversation returned to a more familiar promotional rhythm. However, the earlier exchange had clearly shaped the segment's tone. Instead of feeling like a routine celebrity interview, it now felt more like a reflective discussion about fame, responsibility, and personal boundaries. Whoopi closed this portion of the conversation by thanking Pratt for being open and for engaging in a real dialogue. She said that those moments are what make live television meaningful. Pratt thanked the hosts and said he appreciated the space to speak honestly. He said that even when people disagree, it's important to listen and learn from each other. The studio audience responded with polite applause, and the camera pulled back to show the full panel again. The segment had moved past the initial disagreement, but it had left a noticeable impression, transforming what could have been a simple promotional appearance into a more thoughtful exchange that viewers would likely remember long after the episode ended. As the segment moved further along, the energy in the studio settled into a quieter, more conversational rhythm. The initial tension had softened, but the earlier discussion still seemed to shape how everyone approached the rest of the interview. There was a sense that both Chris Pratt and Whoopi Goldberg were now more aware of each other's perspectives, even if they hadn't fully resolved their differences. One of the co-hosts shifted the focus slightly by asking Pratt how he manages public expectations in his personal life, especially when it comes to family and privacy. The question felt natural, but it also tied back to the broader theme of visibility and boundaries that had already been established. Pratt responded by saying that protecting his family is one of his top priorities. He explained that while he understands public interest in celebrities' personal lives, he believes there should be limits. He said that not everything needs to be shared, and that some parts of life should remain private, regardless of how famous someone is. Whoopi nodded and said that she agreed with that completely. She said that fame can make it difficult to draw clear lines, but that those lines are necessary for maintaining a sense of normalcy. Pratt added that he's learned over time that saying no is an important skill. He said that early in his career, He felt obligated to participate in everything, whether it was interviews, events, or online interactions. But now, he's more selective, focusing on what feels meaningful rather than what feels expected. The studio audience reacted with a few soft murmurs of agreement, which is something that often happens during relatable moments on talk shows. The cameras captured a few people nodding, suggesting that the idea of setting boundaries resonated beyond just celebrity culture. One of the co-hosts commented that this kind of pressure isn't limited to famous people anymore. She said that with social media, many ordinary people also feel expected to constantly share and perform their lives publicly. Pratt agreed and said that the difference is scale, but the emotional experience can be similar. He said that constant visibility can create anxiety, especially when people start measuring their worth based on reactions and engagement. Whoopi added that this is one of the reasons she believes conversations about influence are important. She said that people need to understand how public spaces, whether traditional media or social platforms, shape behavior and expectations. Pratt responded by saying that he doesn't disagree with that idea, but he still believes individuals should have the freedom to decide how they participate. He said that not everyone is comfortable being a public voice, and that discomfort shouldn't automatically be seen as irresponsibility. Whoopi acknowledged that point and said that comfort levels vary, but she emphasized that public figures still have to navigate the impact of their presence. She said that even choosing to step back sends a message, intentional or not. This exchange echoed their earlier disagreement, but now it felt less like a challenge and more like a continuation of the same conversation, just in a softer tone. Both spoke calmly, and neither seemed frustrated or defensive. One of the co-hosts observed that the discussion reflected a larger cultural shift. She said that people today are more aware of how media shapes identity, and that celebrities are often at the center of those conversations. Pratt said that's true, and that sometimes he feels like people project their own expectations onto him without really knowing who he is. He said that while he appreciates being admired, he doesn't want to be misunderstood. Whoopi responded by saying that misunderstanding is almost unavoidable when you're in the public eye. She said that part of the challenge is accepting that not everyone will see you accurately, no matter how transparent you try to be. Pratt agreed and said that he's learned to live with that. He said that as long as he feels aligned with his own values, he can accept that others may form different opinions. The audience reacted with light applause again, reinforcing the sense that the conversation was connecting on a personal level. The mood in the studio now felt calm, reflective, and respectful. One of the co-hosts then asked Pratt if he ever feels pressure to change himself to meet public expectations. Pratt said that earlier in his career, he did feel that pressure. He said that there were moments when he tried to fit into certain roles or images because he thought that's what audiences wanted. He explained that over time, he realized that constantly adapting to external expectations was exhausting and unsustainable. He said that now he tries to make decisions based on what feels authentic rather than what feels popular. Whoopi responded by saying that authenticity is something audiences value deeply, even if they don't always agree with what someone says or does. She said that people can usually sense when someone is being genuine. Pratt said that's why he prefers honest conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. He said that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict, and that different perspectives can coexist. This comment seemed to summarize the entire segment. The earlier disagreement between Pratt and Whoopi had evolved into a broader discussion about identity, influence, and boundaries, without turning into a confrontation. One of the co-hosts concluded this part of the conversation by saying that these topics reflect challenges many people face today, not just celebrities. She said that navigating public and private selves is something almost everyone deals with in some form. Pratt agreed and said that while fame amplifies these issues, they're ultimately human experiences. He said that everyone wants to be seen and understood, but also wants to protect parts of themselves. Whoopi added that this balance is difficult but necessary. She said that being in the public eye doesn't mean losing the right to personal space, but it does mean being aware of how your actions resonate. As the segment approached its final minutes, the atmosphere felt settled. The initial tension had transformed into mutual understanding, even if full agreement wasn't reached. The camera pulled back slightly, showing the panel in a relaxed posture. The studio audience appeared calm and attentive, with no signs of discomfort or unease. The conversation had taken a thoughtful turn, and what started as a simple promotional interview had become a reflective discussion about modern visibility, responsibility, and authenticity, handled in a way that felt appropriate and believable for live daytime television. As the segment began to wind down, there was a noticeable shift in pacing, the kind that often happens naturally toward the end of live daytime interviews. The hosts glanced briefly at the monitors in front of them, clearly aware that they were approaching the final moments before the next commercial break. The conversation slowed, and the tone became more conclusive, as if everyone on the panel was reflecting on what had just been discussed. One of the co-hosts offered a closing question, asking Pratt what he hoped audiences would ultimately take away from his new film, beyond just entertainment. The question felt intentionally broad, almost like a way to give him space to summarize not just the project, but his overall outlook. Pratt responded by saying that he hopes people leave feeling encouraged to think about their own values and boundaries. He said that while the film tells a specific story, the themes are universal, about identity, pressure, and the struggle to stay true to yourself in environments that constantly try to shape you. Whoopi nodded and said that those themes were especially relevant today. She said that people are navigating more public spaces than ever, and that learning how to exist in those spaces without losing yourself is a real challenge. Pratt agreed and said that he doesn't think there are easy answers. He said that everyone, whether famous or not, has to figure out how to balance visibility with privacy and influence with personal responsibility. There was a brief pause after this exchange, not awkward but reflective. The studio audience remained quiet, listening closely, which is often a sign that a segment has moved beyond surface-level conversation into something more personal and thoughtful. One of the co-hosts then thanked Pratt for joining the show and for being open during the discussion. She said that conversations like this are important because they show that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict, and that people can explore different perspectives respectfully. Pratt smiled and said he appreciated being part of a space where real conversations are allowed to happen. He said that even when people don't fully agree, listening to each other can still be valuable. Whoopi added a final comment, saying that she respected Pratt's honesty, even if they didn't see everything the same way. She said that what mattered most was the willingness to engage thoughtfully and openly. Pratt responded by saying that he felt the same, and that he appreciated Whoopi's perspective, even when it challenged his own. He said that these kinds of conversations help people reflect on their assumptions and beliefs. The studio audience then gave a gentle round of applause, not loud or dramatic, but warm and appreciative. It was the kind of applause that signals closure rather than excitement, acknowledging that something meaningful had just taken place. As the camera pulled back to show the full panel, the atmosphere felt calm and settled. There was no lingering tension, no visible discomfort, just a quiet sense that the segment had evolved into something more substantial than originally planned. The show transitioned smoothly to the next topic, with one of the co-hosts briefly introducing the upcoming segment. Pratt remained seated for a moment, exchanging polite smiles with the hosts before standing and preparing to exit the set. Off camera, as often happens after these moments, producers and crew members moved around to reset for the next portion of the show. On screen, however, the audience saw only the composed conclusion, unaware of any behind-the-scenes adjustments. In the hours following the broadcast, clips of the exchange between Pratt and Whoopi began circulating on social media. Viewers shared short segments of the conversation, particularly the moments where they discussed influence, responsibility, and silence. Reactions online were mixed but generally measured. Some viewers sided with Pratt, agreeing that celebrities shouldn't feel obligated to comment on every issue and that personal boundaries are important. Others aligned more with Whoopi, saying that public figures have a responsibility to acknowledge their influence and engage with social topics when possible. What stood out most in the online response was not outrage or hostility, but discussion. Comment sections were filled with people sharing their own thoughts about visibility, authenticity, and the role of public figures in modern culture. Many viewers commented that they appreciated how calm and respectful the conversation remained, especially compared to more confrontational moments often seen on television. Several media outlets picked up on the segment as well, framing it as an example of a thoughtful on-air disagreement rather than a controversy. Headlines focused on the contrast in perspectives rather than on conflict, noting that both Pratt and Whoopi handled the exchange with professionalism. In follow-up interviews later that week, Whoopi briefly addressed the segment, saying that she enjoyed the conversation and that it reflected real questions many people are asking today. She said that disagreements like that are healthy when they're grounded in respect. Pratt, in a separate interview, said that he was glad the discussion resonated with people. He said that he didn't go on the show expecting to have a philosophical debate, but that he appreciated how the conversation unfolded naturally. He also mentioned that he didn't feel attacked or uncomfortable during the exchange, and that he viewed it as a genuine conversation rather than a confrontation. He said that he respects Whoopi's experience and perspective, even if they approach certain topics differently. For viewers who watched the episode live, the segment likely stood out not because of dramatic moments, but because of how real it felt. There were no raised voices, no viral soundbites designed for outrage, just two public figures navigating a difference in opinion in real time. In the context of daytime television, where conversations often stay light and promotional, this exchange felt slightly deeper and more reflective than usual. It showed how even routine interviews can shift into meaningful discussions when participants engage honestly. By the end of the day, the segment had become one of the more talked about moments from the episode, not because it was shocking, but because it captured something familiar to many viewers. The tension between public expectations and personal boundaries, and the challenge of navigating influence in a world where everyone is constantly visible. And as with most moments like this on live television, there was no clear winner, no final resolution. Just a conversation that left viewers thinking, and perhaps reconsidering their own views about responsibility, authenticity, and what it really means to have a platform in today's media landscape. If you watched the segment, you likely didn't feel like you were witnessing a clash, but rather a real discussion between two people with different experiences trying to make sense of a complicated issue in real time. And that, more than anything else, is what made the moment memorable. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.